Getting higher grades and higher test scores doesn't really improve your chances of getting in meaningfully. Writing applications with AI is a very quick, easy way for you to get rejected from basically every school. Admissions does not move at the speed of technology or society. It's more competitive every year, but the basic rules of the game remain the same. Hi, I'm Joel Butterly. I'm the co-founder and CEO of InGenius Prep. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the changing admissions landscape for 2025. So there's a few things that have been moving in the last couple of years that have really changed the way that the admissions game works. The first, which you're probably familiar with, is the Students for Fair Admission lawsuit that was before the Supreme Court that effectively ended affirmative action the form that we knew it. And so we're just getting the first bits of data on this and the way in which this ruling has actually affected admissions. And it's been both confusing and a little bit unexpected. On the one hand, we've seen that certain schools, particularly technical schools like MIT, Caltech, have seen a fairly aggressive drop in underrepresented minority students and admissions in the last year or so. And that's probably a trend that's more or less likely to continue. On the other hand, what we've seen is that there are some schools like Yale, for example, which actually saw an increase in the number of admitted students who identified as Black or Latino. And there isn't really one definitive explanation for this. Part of the explanation for schools like Yale might be that the Supreme Court really did leave open the possibility that applicants could address race in their application materials, such as their essays, and that admissions officers could consider race indirectly rather than directly, meaning that you couldn't just say, okay, plus 2 points because you are this race, or minus 2 points because you are this race. But you could consider the way in which race impacted a student's maturity or lived experience, their extracurricular opportunities, etc. And so that has definitely been interesting to see. We'll probably need a few more years to actually hash out what exactly the long-term implications of this are going to be. The second is that standardized tests, second sort of trend item is that standardized tests remain incredibly confusing. You have test blind schools, and there's quite a few of them, most notably like the UC schools. You have test optional schools. Within the Ivy League, I think the only remaining test optional school is Columbia, and ostensibly it is permanently test optional. And then you have an increasing proportion of schools such as Yale, Dartmouth, MIT, etc., that are going test required or returning to test required. Overall, the trend line over the last 2 years or so has been a return to pre-COVID policies, which is to say more tests required. The reality is that these standardized tests, they do in fact measure something meaningful to an admissions office. That is to say, they do correspond a little bit better to college performance, particularly in your freshman year, than do GPAs. So GPAs are actually less predictive overall. And so that's been quite important. As standardized tests become required, we're probably also going to see a return to, let's call it normal application volumes. In the past several years, when schools went test optional, a much broader set of applicants thought that they were likely qualified for highly competitive schools, and they probably were, because without the standardized tests being a limiting factor, you're really just looking at GPA and extracurricular activities. In general, it's easier to get a very high GPA at most high schools, statistically speaking, than it is to get, say, over a 1,500 on the SAT. And that resulted in a really enormous increase in the number of applicants to a lot of these highly competitive schools. That trend is likely to reverse itself to some extent, which is probably good news for those of you who are good at standardized tests and do very well. General piece of advice on that, we tell all of our students, pretend like these tests are not optional, that they're required. That's probably the best piece of advice that you're going to get on the matter. Just pretend like they are as important as they've ever been. Take them very seriously, take the test. If you don't do well and you're applying to a bunch of test optional schools, you don't have to submit them. But in general, it's better to have them and not need them than to need them and not have them. Third trend line, artificial intelligence. I think this one gets the most kind of playtime in the news and in popular discussion. I'm not sure if it necessarily warrants that. It's probably not had as meaningful an impact on the admissions process or on admissions generally as you might think. I think that things are much more the same than they are different from historical years prior to generative AI. I do think that there's a good and bad. So on the good side, I think that there are certain tools and applications that have made it easier for students to, for example, do school research and create school lists. I do caution students against being overly reliant on AI, because at the end of the day, AI is essentially just pattern recognition. And it matters what patterns it's looking at. That is to say, As it relates to admissions, most of the time that you query or ask a question of something like ChatGPT or Gemini, what you're getting back is a distilled version of all of the information that is available in blog articles online. Those blog articles, some of them are good, most of them aren't. And in general, the advice and the content of those blog articles or of those forums is either overly general or at least partially incorrect. And so I would be a little bit cautious if ChatGPT tells you, well, the University of Virginia is perfect for you. I probably wouldn't take that at face value. Now, AI has also been used by admissions offices in ways that are interesting to basically cut down on the time needed to review applications and also to improve the depth with which admissions officers can review applications. So that's overall a good thing. That isn't bad for applicants. At best, it's neutral. Now, the bad has been that students are increasingly using generative AI and ChatGPT in particular to create application essays or the contents of their application. There are a number of different problems with this. Firstly, there isn't enough publicly available information on application materials, like the actual applications themselves, for it to create something that is of sufficient quality. That is to say, if there was just a plethora of full-length Common Apps publicly available, hundreds or thousands of them available, along with the students' outcomes, then maybe it could create something that was of the quality that you'd want it to be. That really doesn't exist. What does exist is like sample essays that are detached from the actual outcomes or the actual content of a student's application, like their activities lists. So it's just an application essay in a vacuum, combined with a ton of really generic advice like show, don't tell. What you get as a result of this are essays that commit a lot of common mistakes, in some cases mistakes that are effectively disqualifying. And perhaps most importantly, or nearly most importantly, none of these essays are believable. I've personally tried my best to basically get one of these, in my case ChatGPT, to write a compelling application essay to see if it was actually doable. And not only could I not get that to happen, not even close, every single version of it was immediately apparent that it was written by AI and not by a person. Just the patterns of the words and just everything about the tone did not come across as like the tone of a 17-year-old young man or young woman. But in addition to that, there are very simple tools that you can basically plug these essays into that tell you how much of it is written by AI, and it is shockingly accurate. So there was a few times where I would change, let's call it 20% of the essay, and then feed it through the system and see what would happen. And it would come back and it would say it is written 80% by AI and 20% by human. So admissions offices use these tools. Writing applications with AI is a very quick, easy way for you to get rejected from basically every school. So you could think, oh, I'll just write it with AI for like my safety schools and that'll be fine. They'll immediately know it's written by AI and they're not accepting you if it is. So I would strongly caution you against that. And I'm reluctant to use AI, particularly for the essays, at all at this stage. In theory, in the future, it could play a role in helping you brainstorm. But right now, it really just does not have the content necessary to produce quality advice. Trend 4, international applications are going up. And they went way, way down during COVID, and also to some extent during sort of Trump's first administration. It's not particularly surprising that international applications are going up now for any number of reasons, not the least of which is that other popular destinations like the UK and Canada have essentially put limitations on the number of foreign students coming to their country or to their institutions. International students are also a very important source of funding for higher education in the United States because international students, generally speaking, pay full tuition. And the kind of dirty little secret is that if you were to remove them, a huge number of our higher educational institutions would go bankrupt. Not the Harvards and Yales, but you'd be surprised how high up in the rankings you would start to see schools not being able to sustain themselves financially if they lost their international student population. In any event, there's that. I would expect this trend to continue to some extent, if only because Trump's whole take on international students has done a complete 180, which isn't particularly surprising in light of the people who are around him and how much they benefit from having international students, and particularly international workers with work visas in the United States. So I would expect fully that if Trump gets his way with things like H-1B visas and green cards and things like that, that we'll see a continuing increase in the volume of international students. Now, if you're not an international student, this probably doesn't really affect you in most cases. Schools might start taking a higher proportion of international students for financial reasons, but on the whole, you're not really competing with this population of individuals directly. Then second to last trend. This is both anecdotal and present in what data is actually being released by schools, but we're seeing an increasingly large proportion of freshman classes being filled by the early decision applicants. That is to say, schools like UPenn are filling 50% of their freshman class with the early decision population, which suggests that your probability of getting in through early decision is several times greater than your chances of getting in through regular decision. There are probably two different reasons for this. One of them is related to yield rate. The yield rate is the proportion of students who are admitted by a specific institution who ultimately decide to attend. Lower yield rates are bad for the admissions offices because it's part of the way that they are judged by their bosses. It's also bad for rankings. There's a whole variety of things that justify why schools care about the yield rate, but they do. Not necessarily something that you as an applicant care about. So for a school like, for example, for UPenn, they might think, all right, if we don't admit this student in early decision, the student's also going to get into Yale, and they might then decide to go to Yale, and that's bad for the yield rate. So if we admit them ED, they'll definitely come to UPenn, and that's great. The other kind of reason is financial. It is a good way for schools to secure a population of full-pay students in early decision. One of the kind of trend lines that we've seen over the last several years is that the population of full-pay students has declined by about half. So today, only about 16% of students attending private colleges, and I believe it's 24 or 26% of students attending public institutions, are actually paying full tuition. And that is a much smaller proportion than it was historically. So schools are in competition to some extent to ensure that they have a critical mass of students who are paying full tuition. One of the ways of doing that is to admit those students during early decision. And so we've heard stories from institutions that will remain nameless and for people who work at these institutions suggesting that they were admitting close to 50%, not of their freshman class, 50% of all applicants that they received ED. And these, again, we're not talking about Harvard, we're not talking about Yale or Stanford, but we are talking about schools that are considered very selective and also very prestigious. Last trend line, this is not new, but it remains the case, no matter how much information is out there, and perhaps because of the volume of information that is out there, that families really don't seem to understand what governs the admissions process. There's so many misconceptions, and the misconceptions tend to overwhelm the core drivers of the admissions process. Just for clarity, and I'm not going to go into too much depth because I don't want this to go on for an hour, but I'm happy to do a video about this specifically at another time if you'd like. There are really two primary variables that explain 70 to 80% of how admissions decisions are made. At least two variables that an applicant is in control of. So the first one is, are you academically qualified, which everyone is more or less familiar with. The part that people get wrong about that is they tend to think of it as the higher your grades and test scores, the higher your probability of admissions. And that's only true up until a point. Past a certain point, past what we call the threshold level, getting higher grades and higher test scores doesn't really improve your chances of getting in meaningfully. Another way of putting this is that academic qualifications are a binary variable. You either are academically qualified or you are not. Somebody who has a 1600 isn't going to be considered more academically qualified than somebody with a 1550, really regardless of what institution that you're talking about. And that's the first variable. The second variable, and the good news is that most students who really dedicate themselves can achieve academic qualification at the schools that they're interested in. The bad news is that if you actually look at the applicant pool to a lot of these highly selective schools, anywhere between 60 and 80% of the applicant pool is academically qualified. And of that population, those who apply and are academically qualified, often fewer than 1 in 10 are actually getting admitted, depending on which schools we're talking about. That tells us that our second variable is really doing most of the heavy lifting. So the second variable is simple. Are you an expert at something? Have you chosen a passion or interest as young as possible? 9th grade would be amazing, 8th grade amazing, but ideally before 11th grade. That's specific. So it's not just I'm interested in biology or I'm interested in robotics. It's something more specific than that, like evolutionary biology. And have you developed that interest farther than any other student? If you've done that, you will do extremely well in the admissions process. And if you haven't, you won't. One thing I'll say here is that it also falls into the most common misconception bucket is families tend to put a very high emphasis on summer programs, competitive summer programs and competitions. 99% of both of these things are not going to help you in the admissions process. Again, this is an hour-long conversation, but the reality is those aren't the things that demonstrate expertise because so many other students do it. There are exceptions to this as there are exceptions to everything else. But in general, if you are banking on competition performance to get you into college, you are fighting a very uphill battle And your probability of success is about as good as your probability of success being recruited for a varsity sport, which is to say your probability is very low. It can happen, and if you are recruited, for a sport, then it's like enormously beneficial in the admissions process. But for the most part, you're just not going to be recruited. Same is true of competitions. Like for the most part, they're just not going to move the needle for you very much. And in some very rare cases, they move the needle a lot. So my recommendation is to find things that are less commonly done by other students. So things like research, entrepreneurship, certain kinds of internships, really high value community service work that actually relates to your passions and interests. These are things that will actually help differentiate you. And then last point on this is just, there are so many variables that are out of your control that are dictating how the admissions process works. It helps to be aware of them. For example, if you look at the population of students admitted to Harvard, once you've eliminated legacy preferences, the recruited athletes, international applicants, you're talking about, legacy alone is about 30%, but you're talking about a real minority kind of chunk of the pie that is available to you if you're a typical applicant. Most often, if you're a non-legacy, non-athlete white applicant, you might be looking at competing over 8% of the total spots at a school like Harvard. And it's part of the reason that it is so competitive. The other thing is geography. Geography really does matter, right? Schools want geographic diversity. So if you're applying from California or New York or Massachusetts, you're going to have a much harder time getting in than if you're applying from South Dakota, where there probably aren't more than a handful of applicants a year. In any event, that's what we're seeing this year. On the whole, though, admissions, it does not move at the speed of technology or society. So what we see is it's more of the same, it's more competitive every year, but the basic rules of the game remain the same. Thanks very much, and I hope you enjoyed this. Please leave comments below if you want me to do a video expounding upon any of the things that we talked about today, and we'll see you soon.